Castlevania Rondo of Blood was Konami's last standard Castlevania game, released on the TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine as some call it, specifically on the Super CD-ROM Squared attachment. As a result, the game had the ability to hold full-motion videos and high-quality music tracks quite easily. Some people in the audience may be confused as to how this is a CD game. After all, this game predates the SD card by almost half a decade, and Castlevania Rondo of Blood has a save file system. The reason why is because the CD-ROM Squared uses CD-RWs, which means CDs with read and write capabilities. This meant that the hardware to read the CDs, the system itself, was more expensive along with the CDs, compared to the PlayStation, which just uses CDRs, or CDs with read capabilities, meaning that you couldn't write data to them but only read data, i.e. the game, from them, while save data was relegated to SD cards. This is likely part of the reason why the game didn't come to North America, along with the already established failure of the system itself in North America. It wouldn't be worth it to spend excess money to release an expensive game on an expensive add-on for a failed console. That being said, they already paid localizers and voice actors to translate the entire game by then. The game would eventually be released in 2010 for the Wii's Virtual Console, where it found much praise as an excellent classic Castlevania adventure. Without further ado, I present Castlevania Rondo of Blood. The title screen has an optional cutscene that explains the premise of the game in a super artsy way. Basically, a dark priest named Shaft has resurrected the Lord of Darkness, Dracula, with a blood sacrifice. Upon starting a new game, we get an opening cutscene of all things, something that was practically unheard of for video games at the time. It's a short animation that starts with our main character, Richter Belmont, gearing up to enter Dracula's castle and fight him. All the while, demonic creatures emerge in a local village and begin to terrorize it, with 4 maidens being kidnapped by Dracula's forces and taken to his domain. Richter Belmont, understandably livid by this, proceeds to kill all of them in spectacular fashion. I find these short and simple animations that only involve a couple things being on screen at a time work best with this animation style. Because, as we'll see later, the more character-centered animations for when Richter rescues the maidens and they're just talking can look extremely archaic. The 4 maidens are Annette, Richter's girlfriend, Maria Renard, a vampire hunter at age 12 who's also braved the castle herself, Iris, the daughter of a doctor and nothing else, and Tara, a Christian and nothing else. I find these characters can be pretty one-dimensional, that is if they're given the ability to express any form of character at all, and that's because they don't get much screen time beyond getting kidnapped and saved. I recently played a game called Gal Guardians: Demon Purge, by the same studio behind Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon. In that game, you rescue a ton of NPCs. You can talk to them throughout the game for varying dialogue based on what's happening. It's really basic stuff, and the characters aren't too deep or involved with the story, but they are defined, and add some flavor text and secondary perspectives on the situation, and that's all that's really required for something like this. Anyways, let's get out there and kill some demons. The game opens with Richter Belmont dashing towards the castle on a horse-drawn carriage. Thunder bellows once, and he's ambushed by death. This is amazing. If the cinematics in the opening weren't enough, this is just visually dazzling, and sets a very high bar for the visual and atmospheric parts of the game. There's no music, which helps focus the player's attention on the confrontation between Richter and death. This also helps introduce the players to the ultimate moves that bosses will use upon dying. If you can dodge these, you'll be given a free extra life when entering the next level. Richter then arrives in the village from the opening, finding it deserted and ruined by monsters. Just look at how beautiful this all is. The level of detail here is astonishing. There's embers flying through the air, light radiating from the lamps. This place, along with the rest of the game's locales, looks alive almost. There's so much interactivity and detail put into it that it really helps immerse the player in the setting. Although I must ask, why are there candles here floating on nothing? In later levels, like in the castle itself, candles will usually be integrated into the background to make it seem like they're being held on by something, or ornamentally attached to something. But in this one area, they're just floating. In terms of gameplay, this level acts as a short introduction for what's to come. Enemies interacting with scenery, sub-weapons existing, candles existing, you get the point. Richter as a character has very simple mobility and attacks. He can jump around rather stiffly with little aerial control, duck, whip, and perform a backflip in midair to gain ground or avoid attacks. His arsenal is rather simple, but the enemies and level design can test it in interesting or challenging ways for the player. Richter also has several sub-weapons that he can find by breaking candles. They require hearts to use, which can be found by breaking candles, and he can only equip one of them at a time. There's the knife, which is practically useless. It fires 3 daggers forward, which deal next to no damage. The holy water coats the floor in holy flames for a bit, which can help give you breathing room or clear low to the ground enemies. The cross is easily the strongest and acts as a boomerang, allowing for multiple hits to be scored on enemies. The Bible flies out in a circular pattern, also hitting multiple times, and it's capable of blocking projectiles if used right. The axe flies in an arc, capable of dealing incredible damage if you're able to position and fire it correctly. And lastly, the stopwatch slows down time drastically for a short bit, but requires the most hearts per use. All of these weapons also have an item crash, which uses a larger amount of hearts for a super attack of sorts. Most of the time, it's some screen-clearing nuke. This also adds another level of depth to their usage. To replenish your health, you can find meat hidden in breakable architecture, usually walls. Sometimes this meat will also be found right before a boss. I find that a lot of these boss fights are quite difficult, but in a fair way. It's very possible to understand the weaknesses of these bosses and how to dodge their attacks. Even then, you can get away with not completely knowing how to dodge or punish one or two of their attacks. Also, all of these bosses are keenly weak to a specific sub-weapon or item crash, and the stages tend to seriously stock you on hearts. This makes it so that if you don't know what you're doing, you still have a slight advantage, and even if you're a bit bruised or battered from the entire stage before the boss fight on your first attempt, you still might be able to deal a fair amount of damage, learn a bit about their attack patterns, or even beat them. Or if you know what you're doing, you can just wipe the floor with them the moment you get in the room. I'm not sure if I like this, because if you play the game too much and simply get good at it, the difficulty that's supposed to be a part of the game's identity simply vanishes. There are alternate routes to hidden boss fights in every level that require you to either maneuver or use your whip in the right ways to reach them, either finding an alternate path, breaking a wall, or something else. These alternate boss fights lead to alternate levels. Every level in the game has a route that leads to an alternate or regular stage. For example, I could go through stage 1, beat the alternate boss, go to alternate stage 2, then I could either continue to alternate stage 3 by beating stage 2's alternate boss, or go back to regular stage 3 by beating the standard boss. This level of variability can make playthroughs drastically different, assuming the player can figure out the methods to reach these alternate routes. Most of them are rather simple in nature and can be found by accident or with light experimenting, which can help make casual replays more varied. Additionally, you can also use the level select feature to revisit stages you haven't completely explored, or so you could find their alternate levels. A level select feature is really important in a game like this, with branching pathways and of course the Four Maidens. While exploring, you'll come across the Four Maidens, or more likely you'll find about 2 of them, Maria and Annette to be specific. Maria's in stage 2, and finding her is pretty simple. You get the key sub-weapon during the behemoth chase and take it to the conspicuously locked door near the end of the level. Annette is also rather simple. You do the same thing but in the clock tower. I like finding these two because it's rather straightforward and effective. While having the key, you can't use your sub-weapon, which makes you have to play more carefully because there are certain things that sub-weapons can make easier for you, such as clearing out enemies above or below you in specific. Additionally, while you're playing carefully, you'll also have to be observant about where to use the key, which is an incentive to explore more. The other 2 are both held in alternate stages, which is okay, but they're held in really weird places. Iris requires you to whip frog statues. Whipping frog statues will open a pathway to her room. Who is going to whip frog statues and think anything of the sort would happen? It's not very intuitive and pretty much requires a guide for anyone to do such a thing. Saving Terra involves whipping walls at very specific points that you would never accidentally find, and are even quite unlikely to find just by hitting the walls in search for meat, like you usually would, because it requires hitting specific blocks in the walls, which requires you to be at specific different distances. While you're playing certain stages, you may fall into bottomless pits. Or not. In several of the stages, falling into a bottomless pit leads to either being set back one room or getting into a new part of the stage. This is mainly seen in stages 3 and 7. This is a really good way of handling these pits, especially because enemy knockback is a common way to fall down them. It turns from a semi-unfair punishment into a new part of the stage in stage 3, and just makes it fair in stage 7. However, there are still stages, such as alternate stage 2, where bottomless pits are a thing, and you can be knocked down them, which is rather annoying. The levels in Castlevania Rondo of Blood are all really good. They each have their own unique identities and aesthetics, while keeping themselves varied with multiple sub-areas within them. Stage 5, for instance, has you board a ship by first going from the bridge, which is filled with bottomless pits, platforms over them, and enemies. Then you enter the ship and go down to the basement, with mini-bosses and long-ranged enemies in the more cramped and closed-off arenas within the area. And the final sub-area is the top of the ship, without much for verticality, but enemies can drop in from above while you duel with the stronger enemies on the surface below. Just about every stage has multiple segments within it that change the dynamic and locale while still remaining entirely in line with the main theme of the level. The themes of the levels also fit quite well with each other. A burning city, the entrance to the castle, a graveyard, a haunted ship, a dungeon, you get the idea. And what also helps define these levels are the architecture and enemies you interact with. The music as well fits within each stage quite well and is also absolutely amazing. Each and every track is a joy to listen to. However, I'm not sure if this is an issue due to the CD technology being used and maybe there was a lack of space or something, but the songs aren't structured like a standard video game song where it has an intro that leads into a part that loops over itself, and instead the songs just kind of play until they finish and restart entirely. This means that you will be left with some dead air between the songs fading out for no reason and restarting, which is rather jarring. Maria Renard is one of the 4 rescuable maidens unlocked in Stage 2. When you unlock her, you're able to play as her in any stage. She's a very different character from Richter. She has much better mobility with a faster run speed, a slide into a dash, and a double jump for repositioning. She also has a faster firing speed for her attack. But her attack goes in an upwards arc, which can make it hard to deal with grounded enemies. It also has a much lower range, despite the higher DPS, which can even double hit for even higher DPS. Maria's sub-weapons are animal-themed and aren't nearly as versatile as Richter's. Her cat is basically a better version of the Holy Water. While it lacks AoE, it will continue going forward until it attacks about 4 times, with each hit doing devastating amounts of damage. Her birds are a much worse version of the axe. While they do hit both behind and in front of her, the range and damage are just pitiful in comparison to Richter's axe. And the path of the projectiles makes it extremely hard to find uses for, compared to the axe, which can even hit grounded enemies because its arc does reach the ground in front of it. The dragon is basically the cross if it costed way too many hearts to use, but dealt roughly the damage of hitting twice. It's also faster and has a bigger collision box. The songbook is a thing, I guess. The turtle shell is useless, you just hide in the turtle shell and can't take any damage. The issue with this is that you're playing as Maria. You can just dodge any attack incredibly easily. She also has an egg weapon, which is basically just a bomb. It's kind of hard to use because of the timing and awkward movement of the projectiles, as they just go directly up. Unless I have a use for the cat, I find that Maria plays mostly the same, regardless of sub-weapon. Most of the time, I find myself grabbing the dragon and just using it as an instant kill brick for everything in front of me, or just using the cat if I have usage for it at all. These sub-weapons, aside from the cat again, really don't alter Maria's playstyle when in use, unlike with Richter and his sub-weapons. Also, did I mention that these item crashes take way too many hearts to use? I should mention that there is a level and character select feature which allows you to start any stage you've beaten or are currently on with either Richter or Maria. Speaking of those stages, let's delve a bit deeper into them and figure out what makes them work. I already spoke about stage 1 for the most part, so I'm just going to skip to the bosses. There's the Wyvern, which floats about, spews flames, and will swoop down and make itself vulnerable to Richter's whip while doing so. The only issue with the fight is... yeah, the axe just kind of trivializes it. The Serpent, on the other hand, is a lot better. Basically, it uses its large snakish body to wrap around the arena before revealing its head for an attack, sort of like Ceres from Metroid Fusion. This fight is actually engaging because you have to pay attention to everything the Serpent's doing, so you know where to be so you can dodge it and punish accordingly. Stage 2 is the entrance of the castle. It starts outside, there's a storm going on, and it's rather dark out. This makes the lighter colors of the castle stand out, which combined with the general hostility of the weather makes it almost seem like you're seeking shelter in it. The slight contrast of the castle's colors to the darkness outside gives the feeling that while the outside is hostile and dangerous, you're still rather vulnerable indoors too. This is done with the main colors of the castle walls being dark purples, which are close to the blacks of the night and slight blue of the rain. Inside the castle, there are zombies spawning around you to try and overwhelm you. To avoid the zombies for a little bit, there's also high ground you can get up to. although this is still somewhat short-lived as you will be sent back into combat again. There are also peeping eyes which take 2 hits and careful positioning to kill, which compounds the threat of the zombies because when you're fighting one of the peeping eyes, more zombies will spawn around you. Lastly, the most iconic part of the stage is the behemoth chase. This enormous beast will chase you through part of the castle while you avoid pits that lead to a subterranean section of the stage. The behemoth really adds a lot of flair to the stage and to the game in general. This segment is also memorable because of how tense it is. You want to avoid it, but you also want to destroy the zombies ahead of you or potentially grab the key to Maria's room. Alternate Stage 2 is a large bridge with parts of it crumbling as you progress. There are bone pillars to impede your progress, skeleton duelists to have one-on-ones with, and aerial enemies you'll have to be careful of. Towards the end, you can either platform over the water to fight the bone golem in the alternate exit, or continue to the bridge to fight the werewolf. While I do find this stage somewhat boring, I do find it very aesthetically pleasing. The whole stage looks nice, and I really like how it switches from day to night as you get to the end. Although I do think it'd be better if the shift was more gradual. I also like this armored knight, which acts as a sort of mini-boss before the bone golem fight. The werewolf fight is one of my favorites. It jumps around a lot, meaning you'll have to be very careful about your positioning and how to dodge it. It also will encroach on your space a lot, but this can be circumvented by whipping it and sending it flying back. I find it to be a very good test of positioning and dodging, as you have to run around the arena to make sure you dodge its attacks as it jumps around, and position yourself so you don't get your space moved in on too much while it's on the ground. The bone golem fight is a bit different from most bosses. It has 3 forms. It starts out as this centaur thing which punches you. Here you have to make sure not to get pushed back by it while not getting too greedy by whipping it. When it's about to do a punch, both Maria's double jump and Richter's somersault can help dodge in this regard. What I love about these fights is that while there are core skills being honed, the specific ways you fight the bosses can differ greatly. For example, the footage I used for the werewolf fight had the person being very defensive with their holy water and throwing it while getting away from the wolf. Meanwhile, in my actual playthrough, I item crashed the holy water, then went all out on the offenses, driving it into a corner. The second phase of the bone golem has it turn into a winged beast, which swoops down occasionally. As Richter, you'll have to be very diligent about where it moves, forcing you to always be in a position to attack it when and where it will next swoop, and while also dodging its tail. As Maria, you can double jump to reach it, but you have to be very careful about its tail and when it will swoop next. I find this better than the wyvern fight because you can't just cheese it with the axe, and even if you do have an axe, you're only using it on this portion, then you'll have to fight the third phase normally, and you'll already have fought the first phase normally. The last phase is this weird amalgamation that runs around, but can be stunned if it hits. Dodging this thing is just a nightmare as Richter. What even is this fight? The third stage is the chapel, and the first room here is quite interesting, as it involves you clearing one level of it, then ascending some stairs to do the next level of it. However, to keep it from being boring and just having you walk in a straight line and kill everything, then repeat the process, the enemies on the top can actually hit you if you're not careful. The second point of interest is that the pit here actually lead to another route to the end, specifically the arena leading to the Minotaur fight. The Minotaur fight is a game of tug-of-war where you can push him back with your whip strikes to gain room, but his attacks involve him gaining room on you as well. His axe swings cause him to move forward considerably, while his charge puts him on the opposite end of the room entirely. Additionally, each of his attacks cause massive knockback, giving him more room as he moves forward towards you. The reason why having space in this fight is important is because the Minotaur is a gigantic enemy, who takes up an immense amount of room himself, while jumping over him is only impossible from the ends of the arena. Alternate Stage 3 is the cemetery, which is an especially dangerous place filled with tricks and traps, such as these spiked balls, many pits which will set you back up, and a lot of enemies placed in tricky spots. It also has many strong enemies like this mini-boss here and the Gravekeepers. The alternate boss of Stage 3 is the Together, or the Beholder from Dungeons & Dragons, basically. The Together fight involves it floating about while debris and flying projectiles fly around, making positioning rather important around the mostly open but rather cramped arena. I think the Together represents something very important with how simple its fight is, and that's that these bosses are always very simple in nature, but because of that, there are many different ways to approach them, which can make different players form different play styles depending on how they want to approach the fight. Just as a quick example here, the ways I normally fight the Together are either with the axe, because, well, it's a weapon that fires in an arc, therefore it's very easy from the bottom of the arena to hit it. However, sometimes I also use the Holy Water and use its Hydrostorm ability, because that way I can just entirely focus on dodging while the Together is getting hit by my Hydrostorm, no matter where I am and no matter where it is. Stage 4 is a dungeon of sorts. In it, there are many traps and stage hazards strewn about that make progression very interesting. The enemies used here also accentuate stage hazards, as they're made specifically to be engaged without moving into them. The skeletons will pelt you from a distance, but are killed in one hit, while the fleamen are hard to hit and jump about the place. They're also killed in one well-placed hit. The axe armors take a lot of hits, but their attacks can be deflected without even moving. The peeping eyes during this platforming segment are also very similar, especially with the cross-Bible or axe sub-weapons, which are all available to you at this point. What I really like about stage hazards is that after being established, they're built upon. These buttons are placed in areas you're likely to jump into if you're not careful, and the swinging spiked balls are then made into this adjustable swinging spiked ball. Alternate Stage 4 starts out with these frogs jumping around that are just impossible to reach. As Richter, you'll be given the dagger, which has a spread capable of wiping them out from a distance. Same for the crows later on. As Maria, you can pretty much just jump around them since you don't have access to the dagger. The next part of the stage branches off into a stroll through the forest or down a waterfall. I find the waterfall route is filled with too many bottomless pits that will just instantly kill you. The stroll through the forest is nice. It's just a straight line, but it's made interesting by the sheer amount of stuff that's going on. It also helps that it looks really good. The two bosses of stage 4 are Dullahan or Carmilla. The Dullahan is definitely the harder of the two, and is honestly where these fights start really getting intense. The easiest way to describe the fight is that it's a combination of the Minotaur and Werewolf. It takes up a lot of space, has a wide reach to all of its attacks as it jumps around, and getting back up from it is extremely important. The difference is that you cannot push it back. To get space, you must jump under it or get around it. Your sub-weapon use can also dictate how offensive or defensive you want to take the fight, as well as how you dodge its attacks, whether you dodge them into the high ground or to jump over him, or if you just go right back into attacking. The Carmilla fight is a weird one. Carmilla will float on a giant skull and fire projectiles down at you, while her servant Laura will walk towards you and drain your hearts if you come into contact with her. Laura isn't really a threat though, because not only are there no sub-weapons before the fight if you happen to die, but also unless you're using the axe or maybe the Bible, you're going to just want to item crash first thing, and to just shred Carmilla's health. After Carmilla dies, Laura will try and fight you, which really doesn't mean much because she only has 3 whip strokes worth of health. Even the dagger's item crash could kill her, probably. There is no alternate stage 5 until you kill Dracula, which causes it to be accessible as a weird challenge level with no boss at the end. From this point on, there are no more alternate stages, and it's just a clear shot to Dracula's lair. Technically speaking, I already went over stage 5 previously as an example of how varied the stages are within themselves, and truthfully, I don't really have much else to say. I like the mini-bosses inside of the ship. They're a good test of skill. The boss is Death, and he's mostly a test of positioning and endurance. He'll float around the arena and spawn sickles to attack you. You'll have to dodge or whip the sickles away to attack him. Afterwards, he'll change into a second form and start to attack with his scythe head-on. You're given the option of Holy Water or Cross for this boss. Holy Water is really only good with its item crash on the first form, while the Cross is excellent. However, on the second form, Death blocks the Cross directly with an attack of his own. Upon beating stage 5, we have a little intermission of Dracula trying to seduce Richter's girlfriend, setting up that she'll either become a vampire or kill herself. It really doesn't mean much because you can rescue her in the next stage anyways. In the SNES reimagining Dracula X, if you don't save Annette, she'll actually become a vampire who you have to fight. Maybe the developers were thinking of a similar thing here, but it never came to be. Stage 6 starts out rather ominously. It sounds like you're heading directly into danger, which is a normal thing for being right before a boss, but definitely not the moment the stage begins. The music before a boss fight starts playing, and you're just dropped into a room with hearts and sub-weapons available to you. The very next room has Shaft performing some sort of ritual. He then immediately responds to Richter's presence and fires a projectile, and summons 3 bosses for you to fight before leaving. the giant bat, which mostly requires positioning and movement to deal with, the Medusa, which is mostly about getting room from it, the Mummy, which is mostly about platforming, and Frankenstein's creature, which is a mix of pretty much every previous boss's core mechanics. After killing all four, Shaft will reveal himself and fight you. Shaft will teleport around the room while his two orbs attack you. They'll change into one of three forms. When they're engulfed in flames, they'll chase you, and you'll have to run around the room to avoid them. When they're coated in lightning, you'll have to position yourself between or away from them because they'll strike directly downwards with a shock. The last attack will cause them to go around you and periodically make a straight line towards you. With Shaft dead, we can make our way to the clock tower. The clock tower starts with a bridge leading up to the tower. This bridge crumbles as you climb it, and there are large bats coming at you and floating on it. You're given the axe, which can kill them in one hit. Also, the bridge crumbles slowly, which means you can actually take it slow and steady and carefully traverse the path if you wish. The clock tower's first few rooms revolve around verticality. The rooms are mostly vertical with a lot of platforming, stairs, and enemies ready to prey on you. Like these ghosts and skeletons, which will either overwhelm you or pick you off while you're climbing. This is where Rondo of Blood's superior aerial controls come into fruition. In previous games, segments like this would be hellish, but with the backflip, jumping on and off stairs, and item crashes, as most of them are some form of screen nuke, it's very manageable, especially the route to a net, which involves whipping a gear into place while balancing on a rotating gear and fending off oncoming enemies. The final part is the dueling quarter, which has you face off against victory armors and skeleton chickens, brutal enemies with very large area encompassing attacks. The skeleton chickens have a long reach, wide range, but frail bodies, so they're usually placed in platforms away from you to make rushing them down harder. The victory knights, on the other hand, are placed on even level with you, so you can duel them more or less one-on-one. However, if you end up getting chased up some stairs, there's not much that can be done about that. The boss here is Shaft? Well, Shaft's cloak is still imbued with some form of necromancy or something, so the cloak will just be floating on either end of the arena, acting very similar to how Shaft did in his previous fight, jumping around and all that. But his main attacks are summoning reanimated versions of the Behemoth and Wyvern. You're also given your choice of any sub-weapon in the game to fight them with, which I think is really nice, as that allows you to approach this fight with what you think would be best. There's also some added complexity, because you need to use some amount of hearts to get certain sub-weapons in the room before Shaft. The final stage, Bloodlines, has a single staircase in front of you, as Poison Mind plays. This sets the mood as confrontational, as you are just about to fight Dracula. Now, the stairs are a build-up to reaching the top floor and finally fighting the Lord of Darkness himself. There is an aura of absolute dread emanating from the throne room. They're a bit shorter than, say, the Super Castlevania 4 stairs. This is helpful for players because you'll probably die a fair amount of times and don't want to be spending a large amount of time ascending stairs. However, it does sort of lower the build-up because there's simply less building up. The Dracula fight is everything you could want from this game. The music is amazing, he's imposing, the fight is rather hard, and the visuals are absolutely dazzling. The first phase has Dracula teleporting about the arena. Every time he teleports, he'll face you and either fire 3 fireballs or 2 meteorites. The fireballs can be completely whipped away, or you can use the cross as a backup. You can only harm Dracula by striking his head, and his head is only available to attack for a few brief seconds. To win this fight, you'll have to not get greedy, you'll also have to play fast when attacking, and play defensively for most of the fight. Upon having his health depleted, Dracula releases all of his power, transporting you into this beautifully hellish landscape and assuming a demonic form. Defeating this form requires intense precision and offense. Dracula will take an immense amount of area with his sheer size and range of motion while jumping. Getting under him is an important part of the fight, as you need room to avoid his attacks. However, getting under him is also very precise, as waiting a fraction of a second too long to walk under will result in getting hit. The entire fight is a test of offensive and defensive capabilities of the player, while also being a test of endurance. It's easily the best fight in the game. Afterwards, Dracula and Richter have a little dialogue. Dracula mentions how it's human despair and sin that constantly brings him into this world, and therefore his continued resurrection is justice. However, Richter points out that it's the same despair and sin that brings people together to move forward instead of reveling in darkness like Dracula does. But Richter, just like other humans, has desire. It's by desire, which includes dark desires like the ones for death and suffering which bring forth Dracula, that humans prosper, and that's what gives Dracula the power to reign. Richter says that power isn't enough to govern humanity, and eventually something evil like that will crumble. Dracula's castle doesn't crumble like it does in the other games, instead Richter just kind of stares at it, then goes off. If you rescued all 4 maidens, you get another ending where the 4 maidens are there, I guess, giving wishes and prayers to Richter as he comes home. If you don't rescue them all, then Richter just comes home on it. Although, also, he'll have a horse-drawn carriage if you rescue all 4 of the maidens, and he'll just have a horse if you don't. Incredible endings, not worth it at all. It is really not worth your time to collect all 4 maidens just to see Richter come home with more horses than one, and have anime girls in the background. Not really a worthy reason to go out of your time to rescue everyone. What is a worthy reason to 100% the game, however, is that it's fun. It is really fun to go back to each level and find the extra routes, but finding some of the maidens, namely Terra and Iris, can be rather annoying. I find that the confrontation with Dracula at the very end is a bit rushed. I find that a lot of these Castlevania games do have very good premises, with Dracula being brought forth by human suffering and despair to an almost rudimentary point because of how simple human nature can be at times. But I do think that in this instance, especially, it wasn't fully explored as much as it could have been, which, I mean, it makes sense because you couldn't just have Richter and Dracula yapping at each other for so long. That would be boring, stilted, and stupid. So the voice acting is also mostly okay, I suppose. Richter and Dracula are fine. The rest are a bit amateur. Same with some of the audio mixing and overall audio quality, except for the music. The music is absolutely amazing. It sounds good and helps give identities to the levels they're placed in. The entire soundtrack is amazing. Although I do wish the unused track, Cross Your Heart, was used in alternate stage 5, as it's supposed to be mostly a challenge level, which I think Cross Your Heart would fit more. The boss theme, the theme leading up to the bosses, Poison Mind, Dracula's theme, all of it, it's just amazing. My only issue is the previously mentioned looping of the music. It just loops straight from the beginning after stopping a bit, which can be quite awkward, especially when it's something like the Dracula fight looping. I find the snappy parts of the opening cutscene to be quite effective, as Richter just destroys enemies. It works well with the animation style. However, I find the scenes of characters just talking to be quite ineffective, and it just looks jarring. The graphics are absolutely beautiful. The backgrounds, objects, and characters are all amazingly animated and put together. This game just looks beautiful. I really doubt that the processing power of the 16-bit consoles could render some of these sites. The last thing I'd like to mention is that some of these bosses are a bit weird, at least given their locations. The Minotaur is not an example of this, nor are the Serpent and Wyvern. This is because their locations are eased into from the stages they're a part of. It also helps for the Wyvern that it's a fire-breathing dragon, and the city before it was all previously set ablaze. The Minotaur is one of the bosses of the chapel, but before getting to it, you enter a dungeon underneath the chapel which it resides in. This makes sense, and is rather appropriate. Same thing for Carmilla. Her arena is a dungeon area, which makes sense because the previous rooms were a torture dungeon. The Dullahan of the same level, however, doesn't make all too much sense. What is this jousting knight doing in an arena after a dungeon? Perhaps if there was some sort of armory segment, and this was meant to be like a slave coliseum, then it would make sense. This is a very minor complaint, but I think it's important to point out that every room should reflect the setting it's in and fall in line with it. You can have a chapel that has a dungeon underneath it, but what would be jarring and inappropriate is if the boss was a unicorn and its arena were randomly a graveyard. The same level of logic can be applied to alternate stage 2, leading to the Bone Golem, or stage 3 somehow leading to Together. In conclusion, Castlevania Rondo of Blood is a great game, and honestly, what all classic Castlevania-type games should strive to be. Its graphics, gameplay, and music are all just incredible, while the map design is simply fantastic. Next video is going to be on Castlevania Symphony of the Night, I guess.